Everyone, and welcome to our co-team session on building resilience, a live Q&A with two very special guests. For those that I haven't met before, my name is Nick. I am the founder of Co-Team. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I can see lots of familiar faces as well as a few new people joining us for the next 45 minutes or so to talk about a topic that I think is incredibly pertinent and incredibly relevant right now, and something that we should all be really considering and talking about. Our special guests today. So we do have, first things first, Celynn, welcome. Would you like to give a quick introduction?
Thank you. Hi there to everyone. I'm Celynn Morin, South African born from French heritage, living in Surrey in the UK. I am a dietitian by qualification, and about 16 years ago, I started doing workplace well-being initiatives. So I am passionate about helping people increase their resilience, their ability to better manage their well-being, but in a way that is practical and a little playful, so we can have some fun.
Brilliant, lovely to have you with us, Celynn. And I've also shared the link to Celynn's practice there, if anyone wants to just check her out and some of the great work that she's doing in the space. We are also joined by the formidable Bruce Daisley. Bruce, hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Hello, Celynn.
Quick introductions for the uninitiated.
Yeah, so I, for a long time, worked in technology companies. In fact, prior to that, I worked in media organizations. So I ran YouTube in the UK, I ran Twitter across UK and Europe. And during that time, I became fixated with the culture of teams, really, the culture of organizations, and really how any of us can create sort of motivated, positive, and life-enhancing cultures, largely because, candidly, I didn't necessarily always find them in tech companies. Tech companies are very good at marketing these things to outsiders and suggesting that they've got the culture thing cracked, and it's a bit of misdirection, really. Most culture firms, when they talk about culture, they're really trying to just sort of create an appealing light for moths to swarm around, and try and sort of create these fragments of social media content that might allure good people to go and work them. So I became fixated in that. I published that book that's on the screen there. And yeah, absolutely. I guess during the course of the pandemic, I've sort of done a newsletter on the changes that are going on in work. And I've just remained fixated in organizations who are able to build good culture in whatever circumstances.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bruce. And I've shared the link there for those that do want to sign up for the newsletter, Make Work Better. It is fantastic read. And of course, the book there as well, for the shame of self-promotion. Really particularly pertinent even now with hybrid working. So lovely to have you both with us. Now, for everyone who registered, you'll know that we asked you to submit some questions ahead of the session today. And we had some absolutely great questions coming through. So we've tried to pick out a couple of the key ones and the key themes. We're going to bounce around and Celynn and Bruce are both going to weigh in on this. Very different sort of perspectives when it comes to this topic of resilience. It's a very big sort of topic for us to be unpacking. But we are going to be running a live Q&A as well. It is anonymous. We feel like that's just better for people to ask questions. So at any point, if you scan the QR code that's on the screen, you can submit questions as we go, and we'll pick those up as we move throughout. We're together for the next 40 minutes or so, but we're going to just use this time. You're also welcome to type in the chat if you have really specific things that you want to dive in on what Celynn or Bruce are talking about. So we're going to start off with quite a broad question, actually. I'm going to address this to sort of both Celynn and Bruce. Maybe Bruce, if you'd like to go first, but what actually is resilience? It seems to have many different definitions in my experience. So how would you describe it?
Well, in principle, I think the idea of resilience is a really noble one. You know, it exists in nature, it exists in mathematics, it exists in science. It's this idea that we can restore ourselves to an equilibrium. So it's an immensely appealing one. And in truth, when you look into life, society, work, resilience exists all around us, our ability to re-energize. But I think the danger of the discourse on resilience is that quite often, because human beings do have this capacity to sort of readjust themselves and realign themselves. As a consequence, it's just been used now as an expectation. So if someone gets knocked down, or if someone gets worn down or burnt out, then it's now an expectation, because people can exhibit this, it now is an expectation that people will. And in the context of pretty toxic working cultures that a lot of organizations have got, or pretty toxic environments, overwork, burnout that organizations have got, what it really does is a reframing and a repositioning. It transfers the responsibility for improving your aspect on life, your situation, it transfers the responsibility to you. So for me, resilience is one of the big myths, one of the big hoaxes of modern working. I remember I've just spent 2 years writing a book on resilience. And one of the first things that a number of people said to me as I was starting, they said, I'm so fed up with hearing about resilience. In fact, I've got a friend who works in the NHS, and she said, if you mention resilience inside the walls of this hospital, people will thump you in the face. And someone else, a colleague who works at a big tech firm, a friend who works at a big tech firm, said, I'm just so done in with feeling about resilience. I feel exhausted, I feel burnt out. And resilience just seems to be asking me to deal with it. And so, in principle, resilience is a really noble thing. It's actually been so heavily appropriated that it's now become a toxic myth.
Interesting perspective there, Bruce. And I agree with you. It's become a very buzzy topic that started to lose a bit of meaning. Perhaps you say it's a noble notion behind it. Celynn, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I think it definitely is a very, it's a wide spectrum, right? And I think my perspective that I always come from is around whole person resilience. So it's more about the personal, the individual, as opposed to what Bruce is speaking about, which I agree with in terms of cultures and the way businesses approach and use resilience. And I know that one of the questions that are coming up is around, having the permission to not be resilient, or what does it look like if maybe we aren't, and why that isn't actually a bad thing. However, for me, resilience in a personal perspective is about being able to be stretched or to be challenged in various different ways, maybe mentally, emotionally, perhaps physically, and to be able to come back to a neutral place. So the image I always have in my mind is, a tree swaying, in the wind. We had those great storms recently in the UK where some trees blew over and broke, potentially because they were maybe not as stable or not as resilient. Maybe they were a bit brittle. And for me, it's about being able to go through storms, be those mental or physical or emotional, but not lose your integrity or actually break to the point of breaking. So that's what I'd like to add there. So for me, resilience is about the ability to be able to be stretched and challenged and come back to a place of neutrality, and perhaps with a lesson learned, so that the next time, maybe you don't have to go through the same experience in much the same challenging way.
Okay, brilliant. So two very interesting perspectives there around this notion, or around this idea of resilience. For those who have just joined us, we are going through some of the best questions that we had submitted as part of the registration for the webinar. But if you'd like to scan the QR code, you can submit questions as we go as well. I think this is actually quite a nice lead on to some of the points that you were making just a moment ago, Bruce. And I really like this question because I hear this a lot with clients that we work with, but this idea that resilience is becoming a really overused word, and it's just so subjective. And often it means sort of, when a company is telling an individual to be resilient, they're basically telling them to shut the F up and just power through something and stop complaining. So yeah, very curious on your take to go a bit deeper around this.
Yeah, so there's a long history actually of organizations really believing that somehow resilience is about re-engineering a flawed individual. So this idea, look at the experience of work over the last 2 years. The reason why there's a burnout epidemic is not because people are rubbish, not because people are sort of made from some flimsy, inadequate material, but we've just been working too much. We've been working too hard, too much. We're connected too much. But it's a brilliant reframing. It's a brilliant reframing to say, sorry that you're not resilient. I've now got a resilience course to send you on. So it became, a fascination for me. How can any of us of us be resilient. And we see resilience everywhere. Look, let's have a look at the most indelible example of resilience that's sitting right before us right now, which is the remarkable achievement of the people of Ukraine, standing up to the tyranny of a bullying neighbor attacking them. And if you have a look at the way that they're resilient, it's a really interesting contrast to what we're exhibiting elsewhere. So the training that I'm being sent on is individualistic resilience. It's the idea that somehow I need recalibrating, I need re-engineering. There's something in me that needs adaptation. And this immense amount of money, this is a multi-billion-dollar business, selling that resilience training. If you actually have a look at when we see resilience, it's when people feel connected to those around us. Resilience is a collective strength. And, you know, we often make the mistake of thinking that it's some superpower that some individuals have got access to, or some muscle that we need to learn how to flex. Resilience is a collective strength. So the people of Ukraine are a classic example of it. You see really good examples of resilience in organizations where there's a strong sense of social cohesion. I've got a friend who works with the UN. And he was just casually telling me one Saturday morning a few weeks ago how the first thing that the UN do with their projects around the world is look for social cohesion. You know, is a society viable? Well, the one thing they look for is social cohesion. And that's exactly what we get in good organizations, in good teams. The sense that we talk about we don't talk about me, we talk about us. We talk about sort of shared strength. And so when we look at the case study of the people of Ukraine and President Zelensky, it's because there's a strong emphasis on us and we-ness. And look, we see this in business. It's a really nice piece of work done by some social scientists in Italy. And they looked at when workers describe their colleagues. So if they said to them, if when you talk about your team, do you talk about us or them? Or when you talk about your boss, do you consider your boss is a good example of the people who work here? So it's like really sort of evoking a sense of us. The people who did that had both lower stress levels and they were more satisfied with their job. We feel more resilient, we feel stronger when we feel connected to the people around us and reflected by the people around us. So, you know, it's for business, that's a real challenge, because if people are to recognize that actually it's about feeling connected to those around them, or it's about feeling reflected in the management of people around them, then business can definitely see that as an unnecessary distraction, something that isn't core to the job that they're doing. Or in extension, it might lead to unionization, or it might lead to the organization of those workers. So it's an inconvenience. So the way that we're directed to think about resilience is a big misdirection. It's an attempt to say resilience is about an individual strength, when it's based on the research, I would say most decidedly not.
Yeah, interesting take there as well. So this idea of collective resilience, nice example there, drawing it to the current situation in Ukraine, by this idea that collectively we can build resilience as a team, but if we just leave it, if I hear you correctly, Bruce, if we leave it to individuals, it's almost setting ourselves up for a little bit of failure there. And hopefully, I mean, with that subjectivity of the word, you know, that does come up a lot. Like, what does this actually even mean? I think that's a really important point to take away from this. So thank you so much for sharing that. Bringing it back to like maybe a little bit more of a practical level, and this is a great question. I actually had this question from a few people that I can see here in the session today, but are there specific actions one can take maybe to start improving resilience as a team? Celynn?
Sure, and I was just thinking, Bruce, as you were speaking, of that expression around a rising tide lifts all boats. And that is true, because we're not all going to be super resilient all at the same time, potentially. And so when we have that sense of it's not just I, but it's we, so much better. And, you know, there are some clients that I'm working with that are starting to do that, which is great. But I agree with Bruce that in my experience, the vast majority of organizations are not taking ownership as much as they should be around being part of the cause, around why they're actually asking the question or looking for the training around resilience. So if we take it then back to perhaps starting with ourselves and what we can do, I think one of the most important things around any kind of conscious change is conscious awareness. So it's so easy in the fast-paced busyness of our lives to just wake up and then be stimulated with our devices and all this input information all day long until right before we want to actually fall asleep. And then we're so wired, and even though we're tired, we can't switch off. So understanding or being aware of actually, how am I showing up? What am I feeling? Not just what am I doing? I always say that we're human beings, not human doings. And so before we can build on this concept of resilience, or maybe whole person well-being, as I sometimes refer to it, is to become aware of where we're at. And do some self-reflection, maybe use some validated questionnaires to actually notice what's happening. And the approach that I use is to think of, how am I in terms of my mental well-being or resilience, emotional well-being or resilience, physical well-being, and also the sense of meaning or soul, contribution and connection. And then look for areas potentially where we can then make practical changes that are sustainable. Because anybody can start changing their lifestyle and maybe trying to, hydrate, have a digital detox before you go to bed, understand how to reframe, increase your emotional resilience, vocabulary. But it's not easy to sustain that. Common knowledge isn't common practice. And so a lot of the work that I do is spent around understanding neuroscience, behavior change, and helping individuals make practical shifts, smaller changes that they can be consistent at, rather than just intense for a week or two and then end up falling backwards as opposed to falling forward. That's also one of my definitions of well-being, of resilience. Some definitions say, it's about bouncing back from something. I don't quite like that. I quite like the idea of, how do I constantly think about how I can always be strong and maybe be able to spring forward, so we don't have to get to those breaking points, because we've got the right kind of rituals in place that support our well-being holistically.
Sort of, I guess, they're silly, rather than going into a bit of that fight or flight response when something happens. Actually, are we equipped to cope with this and to make better decisions, both individually but also as a team?
Yeah, it's about understanding the triggers and noticing the signs in ourselves. And when we're aware of that ourselves, it's easier to potentially notice it in those around us, in our team, because we all have different triggers and cues of where your frontline defense is maybe not as strong.
Yeah.
And then rather than snap and say something reactive, or cause maybe a bit of a dysfunction in a team relationship, or make a mistake, or do something or say something that you regret, shout at a loved one, rather move from that reactive fight or flight space into a more responsive place. And that's where I do believe the personal ownership around being aware of how we all are can be helpful in terms of helping the whole team or the bigger collective.
Okay, interesting. And we'll maybe go through some slightly more practical tips and tricks around how to do that as well, as we move through. Another great question here, actually, that came in, and I think this one's very topical. Of course, lots of people working in this hybrid world, we're very unlikely to go back to the office. I know that you've done a little bit of study around this yourself, Bruce, from reading your newsletter around, it looks like we're only going to be in the office one day a week, I think, is the sort of notion of the trend that we're going to. But that's a very, very much changes team dynamics. What would you say are the right things as a foundation for a team that is now distributed like this and working in this new way?
It's such a huge issue. I chatted to, because you've got such strong views. Broadly, the reason why in the newsletter I drew on two different sources of research that sort of suggest there's a trend that we're moving towards that is probably inevitable. 1 or 2 days a week in the office is almost inevitable. And there's great work by Leesman, there's great work by probably the world's leading expert in this field, Nick Bloom, just showing the trajectory that we're heading towards. That is a really interesting thing, that I think the sense of we-ness needs to be articulated as a two-way street. It's very easy for workers to think, actually, look, this is all about some concession to me. I've enjoyed working from home. The big reason why working from home is so appealing is pure and simple commuting. If we could teleport to the office, we might be in a very different situation. But what you find is that when workers have got a long commute, it has a huge impact on their well-being. And in the UK, the average commute is 57 minutes. In London, it's 75 minutes. That's each way. So to get to the office for most workers takes 2.5 hours a day in London, and 2 hours a day for everyone else. And so to find from this position, this new equilibrium where people feel like, okay, I've been doing my job. It's not as low as it used to be, but I've been getting my job done and the company's doing well. We're in a situation where now people are saying, I don't want to give up 2 hours a day. For what again? Actually, it's going to cost me money to do that. I don't want to do that. And so we're in this situation where people are debating what to do. Now, I was with one organization yesterday, one housing organization, and they were having a lot of workers, very common to companies around the country. They were having some workers say, I don't want to come in at all. Now, this is where that sense of we-ness is really critical. And where do we see an articulation of the sense of we-ness? The sense that actually sometimes we all have to do something for collective good. Vaccines are a big articulation of it. Actually, you might say yourself, look, I don't want to be vaccinated, but it's the reason that these things are helpful is because if everyone does it, then we're afforded a collective protection. And it's similar to the experience in work. I think there is going to have to be some reckoning where we say, actually, giving our workers really strong autonomy is really critical, but there are some non-negotiables, whether that is we want people in the office 1 day a week, to have some sort of network effect to people being around each other, or what organizations like WordPress do. WordPress is actually sort of created by an organization called Automatic, but they say when they hire you, they say we're remote first. They don't say fully remote, we're remote first, but it's in your contract that once a quarter you have to go to be present with other members of your team or your company. That's not negotiable. That's sorry, I didn't get a babysitter. That's sorry, no, my dog is feral. I can't leave him alone. No. It's part of your contract that you're going to go and be with those colleagues. And it's that sense of we-ness. I think there's two parts to it. So it's not just like the organization respecting what you want, but also you respecting that actually being part of something is about a quid pro quo. So I think this is really critical. Now, the big change there is that I think if we start from a perspective of thinking, okay, we're not going to be spending 4 days in the office, we're maybe not going to be spending 3 days in the office, we then need to decide specifically what the office was for. And I think a lot of organizations haven't necessarily unpacked that. So the things I hear, I worked with one big retail firm last year. They told me something that was very familiar. They'd returned to the office last summer. They said, people are getting frustrated that they've nominated their days in the office. They're going in and spending all day on Zoom calls with people sitting at home. And this is because we haven't been specific about what the role of the office is for us. The office has got sort of 5 functions really. One of them is meeting people by appointment, meeting people by accident. The office is a workshop where we do our work sometimes in some jobs. The office is a place of learning, and the office is a place of team cohesion. And I think unless we're specific about which of those we're seeking to access on particular days, we will find workers say, listen, I didn't need to go in to do back-to-back Zoom calls with, status updates where there wasn't a lot of discussion, where we were just sharing our plan for the week. And so we need to be really clear about what we're trying to accomplish by going into the office. I think this is the critical moment we're in right now. And thinking, therefore, the 5th one I mentioned there was the office is a place of team cohesion. Thinking, therefore, how you can curate gatherings, how you can think about what are the reasons why people are together and what you're trying to accomplish, I think is a most important skill.
Great, really interesting. And again, lots of the clients we're working with having that same conversation around hybrid now. Like, what does this even look like? And it requires a bit of a fundamental rethink, like you said, Bruce. It's not just transplant what we've been doing remotely for 2 years back into an office environment, because then suddenly you're sort of getting the worst of both worlds. That actually, the next question we've got here, actually, and this is one I was going to draw on you both a little bit. The best ways to promote resilience in a corporate company. But we also had a live question just come through, Bruce, based off what you were saying. So I just want to read that out quickly as well in context of this. But you talk about businesses peddling this idea that if you can't handle the pressure, you need to build your own resilience. Yeah. So on a practical level, how would you recommend approaching your manager to talk about the pressure or stress that you're feeling without their answer being, go and build your resilience? So I think that's a very interesting question, Bruce. I don't know if you've got a take on that, and then we jump over to Celynn.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's largely a reflection that we've got this individualistic model of resilience, and sometimes it's enhanced by some of the hero stories we see. You know, we watch TV shows about sports stars who seem to be incredibly resilient, you know, have personal setbacks and suddenly they triumph over them. Or we see, you know, we watch the movies we watch are almost always about superheroes who have had, you know, the amount of parental death for superheroes seems to be off the charts. There seems to be something that correlates there. So we see these stories and we're thinking, hang on, well, if Spider-Man's parents died, these resilient stories that are sort of celebrated by us. Resilience is a collective thing. And actually, when we see examples of it everywhere, we can very quickly learn that ourselves. Actually, I've felt resilient when, yeah, I did feel like my boss had my back. I did feel like the team were always together. And maybe that's the reason why I've not felt connected in the last 12 months. Right at the start of the pandemic, actually, just a brief bit of research. Right at the start of the pandemic, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, probably the world's leading experts studying teenagers and the impact of social media on teenagers and phones on teenagers is a brilliant academic called Jean Twenge. She teaches out at Stanford. And one of the things she observed in the first 3 months, she was expecting that it would be off the charts, that people were having, teenagers were having mental health crises. Now, this is right in the start of the pandemic, right? So you've got to cast your mind back to when, you know, maybe you're locked in the house, you're going for your daily walk, there was family meals or, you know, household meals together. What she discovered was in that period, resilience went up. Why? Because the kids, for the first time, were having a family meal with their family. They were sort of chatting to their brothers and sisters. They were finding that their sense of we-ness, their sense of us-ness was really enhanced by that moment. Really interesting that, you know, while it might have changed over the course of the pandemic, that first moment is a really important illustration that resilience actually is the power of us. Is when we most vividly see it. So what can organizations do? Look, I'm always empathetic with people who find themselves in a situation where their boss doesn't get it and they want to try and sort of bridge this. I always think the best thing that you can do there is try and find an article or something and say, oh, look, I saw this. I wonder if in our team away day we could discuss it, or I wonder if we could have a collective discussion about what people think about this. You know, specifically, when I was at Twitter, we had a real issue with burnout, off the charts burnout. It's largely because the emails in the organization were 24/7, all weekends as well. And we had a big issue. People were quitting with no job to go to. And so we sat down, the most senior leadership, we sat down around a table and there was a resolution amongst the leaders. Okay, this doesn't seem to be happening at our competitors. What can we do? And there was a resolution. We're not going to have this weekend email culture. 2 weeks in, and the way we'd got to that, we'd shared articles about how those things lead to burnout. We'd shared a discussion. And so to some extent, the most senior leaders made the aha connection themselves. They were like, oh yeah, this seems to be bad, and here's good evidence for it. So it wasn't like they were being told, we need to do this. 2 weeks into our weekend email hiatus, there was a bad set of numbers went around, and the number 2 in the organization, a formidable alpha male, he started sending emails, and someone emailed him going, just a quick one, just a reminder, we agreed that we weren't going to do weekend emails. So it was, look, it was baby steps along the way. It was that person reaching a decision themselves, then holding to them to the commitment. But I'm always empathetic. If your boss doesn't feel like they want to acknowledge these things, to some extent, you've got to see if you can bridge that gap with insight, with third-party thought, and then, you know, maybe your perspective is, okay, this person's unsavable, and I don't necessarily want to spend my life trying to send someone on a correctional course that they don't want to be corrected on.
Great story there. Great example too, Bruce. Almost like just putting it on the agenda. Maybe you can send the recording of this webinar later to your bosses. Be like, I attended this thing on resilience. There's probably some good stuff in here. Celynn, any sort of things from your side that you've come across, particularly around promoting sort of well-being and that in the workplace?
Yeah, I think what's great lately, as opposed to maybe before the pandemic, is that well-being is no longer just seen as like a tick box exercise and a nice to have. We're absolutely understand the connection and how it can help with engagement and retaining good talent and impact positively on the bottom line. Another thing that could help is to bring in external experts on the topic to get an objective view and maybe do a few focus groups and have conversations, because when we're in the woods, so to speak, we can't often see the trees. And so I find that when I've worked with organizations that have done that, that's often been helpful. And to Bruce's point, at the beginning of lockdown, it's true. Like, we all took advantage of that time that we had to go for maybe, here in the UK, we were allocated 1 walk a day and people were sitting and having meals together. And however, over the time, as we're no longer commuting for those 2 hours, there's a choice when you are at home. Do you put those good habits out the proverbial window, or do you then let work creep in, which is what's happening? Where, we just don't have this demarcated rituals of leaving the office, walking back through the front door and entering a new time of our day, be at the end of the day. And so we need to really relook that and how we help our employees and teams understand that through engaging education. It's easy to throw content on the stuff. We all know what we should be doing, more or less, around eating well and resting and balancing and stress, but that's not helping. So I also think it's also looking at the quality and the type of engagement and training that really drives engagements and gives people practical tools. I'm all for making things practical, not just throwing more theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and just trying to do things differently. Someone said to me recently, are we working from home or are we living from work now? Yeah. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And one that, like you said, a lot of people are using that commute time to just do more work. Whereas maybe their commute time was their switch off, was their time they read a book or listened to a podcast or, listen to the latest hits on Spotify. But just trying to find that balance back. So then you mentioned this earlier, and I think this is a nice lead into this question, but is it an advantage to always be durable and strong? Because you said earlier, like, sometimes we're not going to be, but that's okay. I'm just curious on your take on this.
Yeah, I think that question made me think immediately of Ted Lasso. So I don't know if anybody's seen the series where, talk about always appearing to be strong. I almost stopped watching it in the first few episodes because I was like, I can't relate to this individual. It's just too much. And then, of course, as you watch it, you realize, wow, there was strength in his vulnerability and how they all showed up authentically. So absolutely, there is a disadvantage to always being resilient and strong. And I think another factor that can help organizations is to ensure that senior leadership, and then, of course, managers, are showing up authentically, that we actually give people permission to not be okay. And I always say, if we suppress what we may label as negative emotions, and they aren't negative, being tired or having burnout is real. So when you notice the signs, ineffectiveness or cynicism or low energy, which isn't alleviated by sleep, we can't pretend that that's not there. And we can't just have a weekend off and then feel good. So I think it starts with senior leadership supporting it, and also bringing in a culture of how Brené Brown speaks about, authentic, vulnerable communication.
And certainly that's that role of leadership is, shifting, accelerated a lot in the past 2 years, but the role of the manager.
And also, if we don't have the permission or the ability to, or if an organization lacks the psychological safety to maybe go speak to a manager about these things, and these feelings are just suppressed, they might be expressed in a person's personal life, which then makes them unhappy there. Or if we suppress them, we know now that the science supports that the body will express it in an unhealthy way. We can create distress and disease. So we actually want to be able to speak about what we may perceive as being negative, be it frustration or anger or fatigue, in a way that's safe.
Very big topic there around that idea of psychological safety, and that being able to speak up to your boss to say, I'm actually not feeling okay. And lots there that teams can do, and a lot of our programs sort of really dial in on that, right? Trying to create that environment where people become more comfortable to talk about these things that are quite personal but also incredibly impactful on their work. Our last sort of question here, and this is a great one actually for Bruce, and then we've actually had quite a few questions submitted, which we'll go through as well. I just want to save some time for that. But this word resilience, you started the session, Bruce, by saying it's very overused, it's very almost jargony. Like, should we even be using this word anymore?
I'd put a health warning on it. So generally, when you hear the word resilience, you need to ask yourself, why is the person using it and what's their objective? So, I'll give you sort of an indelible example. I found myself on a radio phone in with Robert Peston, and he was talking. We were talking about those A-level results a couple of years ago, where loads of people seemed to get their A-level results from sort of a scratch card, random letter generator. And Peston's response to that was, well, I think it's time for young people to be more resilient. And I don't know if you remember when you got your GCSE results and the stress, the anxiety, your A levels, the stress, the anxiety, like the whole world felt like it depended on these things. Imagine if you're expecting a B and it came out as a U, like the sense of self-defeat. And so so let's think, why did Peston use they need to be more resilient? Because normally resilience means just go away and be someone else. Go and deal with it. Go and deal with it. And so you see it all the time. My partner's Lebanese. I was in Lebanon, where there was like this massive explosion a couple of years ago. And the BBC, the New York Times, they all use the word resilient. We know the Lebanese people are resilient. What that basically means is, seems loads of bad stuff happens and they just get on with it. Just go away, just get away out of my face. Well, that's often what's happening when your work is sending you on a resilience course. There's a really interesting example where the health and safety executive in the UK, in about 2003, they intervened in one of their health authorities in West Dorset Hospital. And it was one of the first instances of the use of resilience in a sort of a toxic way. It was described by the health and safety executive that this organisation, this hospital, was operating with a toxic culture. And so what the hospital did is they sent everyone on a resilience course. So immediately, it's like, hang on, actually our hospital's fine. We've just hired some really bad people. The people of West Dorset just aren't good enough. And it's immediately reframing. So the question I would always ask, when you hear the word resilience, you've got to ask what the motivation is for the person using it. So, if someone says, I want us all to be more resilient, and here's what we're going to do together, right, okay, seems fair enough. But when you hear someone saying such and such person should be more resilient, those people need to be more resilient, you need to ask the motivation of the person using it. So I caveat it, it's a helpful word. It's a word that you often stumble into, it's sort of a trending topic. It's grown in popularity about 6,000% in the last 20 years. So it's a really growing word, but just, I would use it as a little tell. If you hear someone using the word resilience, ask yourself, are they really meaningfully trying to solve something that's gone wrong, or are they just asking you to shoo away and go and play up the other end? So I think that's a critical thing for me.
And that definitely comes back to that question that we had earlier as well, Bruce. So when your manager's just telling you to go and be resilient or go and do this, like, fix it, don't bother me with it. It's destroying a lot of the hard work that's coming in there. We have some other great questions that have come through, and only about sort of 7 minutes or so left. So we're going to whiz through these quite quickly. And I guess I'll just throw them over to each of you. Feel free to also ask questions in the chat for anyone that might have these. But we've sort of answered this in a little bit, but how do you build resilience for a team when their company should just be offering lots of short-term wellness benefits because they see others offering them in the market? So it becomes like a checklist exercise, like you said, Celynn. Any other further sort of thoughts on that?
I think we should offer personalized, bespoke interventions. Like, I just had a briefing this morning with the client who has a team that are at burnout, and they're offering every single well-being perk you can imagine. They're a hip and happening, forward, high-growth company, but something else is driving the burnout. And so, they're then looking, okay, let's go outwardly because the manager is not getting the answers. And I perceive that the manager is actually the problem. Now that I've had the conversation with her, at least, she can't see that, but I can perhaps then guide, how things go. So I think personalized, bespoke interventions that are team specific.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Spoiler alert, if she's chosen to dial into this call then today.
Yeah.
I had a meeting with Celynn this morning.
I've had 3 meetings this morning.
Okay.
Again, I think you sort of answered this one a little bit before, Bruce, but anything else to add to it? But detoxifying the idea of resilience and turning it back into a positive thing rather than perhaps they're lacking it.
There's something I spent sort of ages looking at workplace culture and trying to understand workplace culture, and you get loads of really interesting definitions of it. And there's some, if anyone is interested in book recommendations, I'll always give book recommendations individually if you want them. But there's something that sort of runs through a lot of them that we often miss. Good workplace culture is normally a sense that we're all in this together. That we're all in this together. And you see really good examples of it. There's one really brilliant exploration of retail stores, supermarkets that give good workplace culture. And what you see good examples of one of the best examples. The leader of it is asked to explain why they have such high staff retention. He said it's not to do with the money. This organization pays well. It's not to do with the money. It's the fact that everyone here knows that their managers would do every job that they do. And that whether that is cleaning out the bins, whether that is doing freezer work, whatever it is, the managers will do the same. We're all in this together. And that sort of runs through that idea that Zelensky embodies, or that, when we look at the management of Jurgen Klopp, he talks about we, us, the boys, all the time. So good culture is about, and resilient culture is about this strong sense that we're all in it together. And I think quite often we've bridged away from that. We've found that organizations don't manifest that sense that we're all in it together. And so as a consequence, if we're working really long hours and we feel like our bosses don't understand that, or they don't respect that, that's where you often have burnout, lack of resilience. So I think, the most critical thing for anyone is understanding how we can all feel like we're all in this together.
Big role again there for management to play in this, that
Totally.
Notion of servant leadership, but being able to lead people from behind and actually not be afraid to empty the bins, as you would say. A little bit of a build on that again then. So it's not necessarily the individual who's responsible for resilience. Is there specific ways that leaders should be held accountable to this? Any other examples that come to mind immediately, Celynn or Bruce, where you've seen a leader really taking responsibility for this, taking accountability?
Well, I think it's important to equip them, if we are asking them to be able to do this, to support them, and perhaps slightly in a different way to how we would an entire organization, for instance.
One of the things we found when I had that burnout epidemic at Twitter, one of the things that was pretty evident was that people were reporting there weren't enough hours in the day, but we had really high meeting count. And so I knew I couldn't change, specifically, I couldn't change some of the way that we interacted with the head office in San Francisco, but I could influence the day-to-day impact. So it became, okay, can we halve the amount of time we spend in meetings? So there's three ways to do that. These reduce the amount of people you invite to meetings, you reduce the length of the meetings, or you reduce the frequency of meetings. And if you say, okay, my people are spending 22 hours a week in meetings, if we could get that to 11 hours, I'm basically saving them a day and a half. So it's a management act that can be transformational for those people concerned. They suddenly feel like one of the biggest determinants of sort of a feeling of well-being is a sense of control. Suddenly you feel like, okay, I can breathe. I feel like I've got time to get my emails done. I've got time to actually pay attention in meetings because they're faster, they're punchier. So that's what I would say. Middle managers often can feel like they're just the router switch, that they're just connecting demands from up high with expectations from below. But just trying to reduce the incidence, the impact of day-to-day work on people can be a little bit more straightforward than we initially think. We initially feel a little helpless. Well, what can I do? I've got these expectations. You say, okay, this meeting, here's what we're doing. We're making it, it's going to sit in your calendar every week. 1 week, it's going to be, we're actually going to work together on, we're going to be available for chat, for phone calls, for dealing with sort of documents that we're working on. The following week, it's going to be that we're meeting in person, or you alternate that, you change that. So people feel like they keep the time on their calendar earmarked for that team. It's what one meeting expert told me. He calls it magic time. And so, trying to think about doing things in a slightly different way. Once you acknowledge that you can have those bits of leverage, middle managers have a little bit more power than they may sometimes imagine.
Amazing.
Another practical example is perhaps to also make meetings 25 minutes instead of half an hour, or 55 minutes instead of an hour. And that little extra time can help give people that breathing space that Bruce just mentioned.
I've just shared a great little article I read as well from a New York agency called Percolate. They developed 6 rules of effective meetings, which I encourage many teams to read and to follow. But yeah, 6 very simple rules there. We'll whiz through these questions. Do you think hybrid work is incompatible with the idea of the 4-day work week? Bruce, I think that's a question square on you.
Really interesting if we start looking at some of the emergent trends. So one of the emergent trends that Leesman, who are a company that sort of benchmarks offices and measures office productivity, they've been tracking some mind-blowing figures, which show the demand for office space. And the demand for office space across the board has halved in this sort of last 2 months that we've been trying out hybrid working. The demand for office space on Fridays has gone down by 3/4. Really interesting. Friday demand is 27%. In fact, on my newsletter 2 weeks ago, I featured a charity that's been using that space. I've been saying to organizations, if you're not using your office on a Friday, can we use it to train people? Amazing. So really interesting. We're starting to spot the change in the way that different days are constructed. I think a lot of people are already starting to say, my Friday feels different. Maybe they have meetings till lunchtime, Friday afternoon, maybe there's a bit of paperwork, you know, we're sort of doing things in a slightly different way. So we're already developing towards that. Whether it becomes more explicit, I don't know, but I think we're already starting to, you know, now, if a calendar invite comes for you to have a meeting at 4:30 on Friday, you feel like it's an abuse of your human rights. So we're already starting to recognize that these things are adapting. And I think they're probably developing before our very eyes.
Yeah, some interesting stuff happening there and some really fantastic initiatives. A question directly for you here also, Bruce. Read the individualist pressure from popular media. Have you noticed better approaches to teamwork and culture in some cultures that have different approaches? So we've cited a lot about the UK here. But...
Yeah. Look, I think what we know is that the remote working experience has been incredibly popular, and it's for that commute reason, there's actually a really interesting diversity and inclusion element to it, where when we ask workers, there's an organization called the Future Foundation, which is looking at a lot of research into the future of work. And they did some work and they found that 20% of white office workers were excited about the return to the office. So excited, small number. 3% of black workers were excited. Why? And we might go, hang on, well, what's the difference? You know, from our sort of white privileged perspective, it's because the continuous microaggressions that people from different ethnicities feel makes the office exhausting. And I heard exactly the same 2 days ago. I was on a call where someone said the reason why, a woman in her 20s, the reason why I'm quite happy to be working from home is that there's none of the casual all day sexual harassment that I used to experience before. People commenting on my appearance, looking at me. I just felt sort of defiled every day. So we don't necessarily witness those things, but remote working is a diversity and inclusion issue as much as anything else. So it's been immensely popular. And I think the challenge for a lot of people now is that, okay, how do we retain some of that sense of team cohesiveness, societal connection between the people? They feel like they're part of a shared project. How do we do that with them working from home 4 days a week? And that is the holy grail. That is the secret sauce, because there's a lazy instinct, which is, okay, let's invite people in for one Wednesday a month and fill them full of booze. And yes, that works to some extent, but it works with a small portion of your cohort, and it's a little bit estranging for others. So the secret sauce right now is going to be, how do you build strong, cohesive cultures? What time do you need to commit to that? And what advantage does that give you? And I think that's the big opportunity for anyone right now, to work out exactly how you create something that feels really special.
Really links back to the sort of personalized interventions piece that Celynn spoke about earlier. They were all a little bit different. 2 more questions. So, just any sage advice on how to help my team to not to feel as if they have to be resilient without losing the accountability? Celynn, do you have anything?
I think once again, it's in the intention and how the message comes across, because as Bruce and I have both said, it's a two-way street. It's not like it's only for the head of the team or the organization or the culture. It's both ways. And I think it's about being able to communicate that, having a forum, a portal to do that and to be heard, and then have accountability on both sides. A lot of the work I do is around helping the individuals look at their own personal resilience and accountability, and at the same time highlighting and supporting the managers and leaders. I think it's both ways.
We do also have some fantastic tools available here at CoTeam if you're interested in them, that can help measure some of these things in a slightly more quantitative way. And feel free to reach out to me, whoever did submit that question, and hopefully I can steer you towards the right things. And last but not least, boundaries. Oh, what a great topic. What are the main boundaries to improving work culture, to allow what we're talking about here maybe to become a bit more ingrained? I'd love to hear from both of you on this. But if you had to give one boundary that you think we had to set, what would that be? And we need to promote.
Go ahead, Bruce. I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest thing for any of us, I mentioned it before, a sense of personal control is a really big determinant for our well-being. So if you open your calendar in the morning and you've got back-to-back meetings, or you feel like you're on constant video calls and there's no time to breathe, it's no surprise that we feel claustrophobic, we feel breathless, we feel overwhelmed. And so giving someone the space to have some autonomy over their calendars is one of the most critical things. That only comes if you create a climate that says, okay, we're going to try and fastidiously reduce the amount of time we spend in meetings. Because, that thing where you say, okay, we're just going to keep an hour free every lunchtime for people not to work, it often gets railroaded because, there'll be someone saying, well, we need to meet, we can either meet in 3 weeks' time, or could you do Monday at 1 o'clock? And so very quickly, those things get railroaded. Unless you try to create a culture, which is how can we reduce, get rid of meetings. And it's a lot harder than it looks. And I think anyone can recognize that. But quite often, the strange thing I always think is, if we knew when we were kids how much of the time we were going to spend as adults pretending to pay attention, you think, that's such a disappointing waste of adulthood. Sitting on Zoom calls, pretending not to do emails, sitting on Zoom calls, pretending to listen to the person in the Manchester office. So, it's trying to sort of actually be candid, be honest about what we're doing, really.
I love that. Anything from you, Celynn?
No, I think that's great. And I also think giving people permission to actually know when enough is enough, when there is always work to do. So there's always going to be emails to answer, potential articles to read, and work to do, and to be able to give people permission, depending on what their lifestyle calls for. That could mean having a later start in the morning for somebody. It could be, maybe stopping early in the afternoon for somebody else, and helping them to also be able to articulate their own boundaries. Amazing.
Yeah, and prioritize collectively as a team as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I mean, there's so much to take in from this session, and I do really appreciate you both taking the time out to join us, as well as everyone who's been here. In terms of, if you haven't done so already, we do offer a free 10-day program which touches on some of the topics that both Bruce and Celynn have been talking about here today, designed to make you a more empathetic or compassionate manager in 10 minutes a day for 10 days. Delivered entirely via email. If you do want to sign up for that, you can just scan the QR code that you see on the screen there. I will also drop the link in the chat box. I guess, Bruce or Celynn, any closing thoughts before we bid everyone farewell?
I think stay curious and connect with yourself authentically so that you can do that then with others, and keep looking for opportunities to be grateful or find joy, no matter how busy you may be or not busy, or resilient or not. And from Bruce, any closing words?
I've just really enjoyed the opportunity to firstly hear those questions, hear from Celynn and yourself. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Brilliant. And I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for who's joined us. Definitely sign up for that program if you haven't done so already. And keep an eye peeled for our next webinar series.
Cheers.
Have a great day.
Cheers.
Cheers.